Hello, Chris.
Morning, Jason.
Well, good morning indeed.
It's not Friday.
It's not Friday, and it's not afternoon. This is uncharted territory for us.
I know.
Today we are joined by a special guest, one we are both very excited to have on the show, and I will let her introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Eileen Uchitelle. You can find me online at Eileen Codes, and I work at GitHub on the app systems team. That team is responsible for Rails and Ruby and our open source libraries and making sure that they all work smoothly for our application.
Awesome. How long have you been with GitHub now?
Almost exactly 2 years. It was 2 years on January 10th.
Awesome. How is life at GitHub post Microsoft?
It's good. I really like Nat. He has a good vision for GitHub, and Microsoft's not really that involved. So, we're operating independently. So not too much has changed. The stuff that has changed has been for the good.
Awesome. That's I guess that's the best you can ask for.
Yep.
So just wanted to kind of chat with you, learn more about you as a person and programmer. So I guess I'll just kind of jump into it. How long now have you been programming?
Oh, I don't know, 10 years?
Okay.
Maybe 11. I don't know. I think 11 years. It depends on whether or not you count Flash ActionScript as
sure.
coding.
So I guess what kind of led you into programming?
Well, it was sort of accidental. I was a photography major in college, and I wanted to take this printmaking class, but it was full. So I was like, what fits in my schedule? And there was a graphic design Flash class. And I figured, well, what's the worst thing? I learned how to build myself a website. So I took that class and I really enjoyed it. I don't really enjoy ActionScript. It's not a great language, but it was fun to be able to do the visual and the programming side of stuff together. And so then I took another HTML and CSS class where it wasn't very advanced. They were still teaching tables instead of divs, which is weird. But
it's weird to think about now, but that was like everything. When I learned HTML, everything was tables still.
Yeah. This also wasn't like a class taught by a programmer. It was a class taught by a designer who learned a little bit about programming. So it was sort of like afterwards I was like, I want to learn more. And he's like, well, then you're a programmer and not a designer. And I was like, I'm just a photographer, man. Like, I don't know. I just want to learn stuff. I don't understand why you're trying to put me in a box. So yeah, a lot of stuff after that, I taught myself some more front end stuff. And then I taught myself WordPress and through WordPress PHP. And then I went to Big Nerd Ranch, which was, I think they're still around, but they were more just Ruby and Rails classes back in the day. And it was a week-long intensive of 2 days of Ruby and 5 days of Rails. And so I'd dabbled a little bit in Rails, but that's really what got me interested in Ruby and Rails and doing all of that good stuff. And I abandoned WordPress for Rails. Although WordPress is great for some stuff. I've still actually built a WordPress site last year because it just made more sense for what we were doing.
I actually agree. So my path's very similar. HTML, CSS. Then I got into WordPress and PHP, and then Ruby and Rails, the exact thing. And recently, I moved my blog back to WordPress. And I was like, this just makes sense. It works.
Yeah. Yeah. The only reason I don't have my blog on WordPress was because I used to have a Rails blog, but I just got tired of managing the server that it was on because I built my own server for it. And that was fine when I was doing more ops stuff. Or I worked at an agency. I was doing everything. So from design to programming to the ops stuff. So that was fine when I was doing that. But then when I was doing Ruby full time, it just became too hard for me to like keep up with all of that stuff. And I actually spent like a couple of months working with one of my friends to build chef scripts to do it for me. And after a couple of months, I just went, sorry, dude, this is way too hard. And I'm just going to use Jekyll. Yeah. I felt really bad, but it was months of this. And it just became clear that I didn't have the skills to keep up with it. Because it's just two totally different skill sets that you need to keep up with to be able to not have a vulnerable server.
Right.
And it was just too much work.
I backtracking a little. Sorry, my wife keeps opening doors and my alarm goes off. Did you finish college like with the photography major?
Yep, I have a BFA in photography.
Awesome. Have you do you keep? Sorry, hold on. Do you keep photography around like as kind of like a side thing now, like passion project at all, or just mostly programming?
Mostly programming. I still have my camera, but I feel like I'm the kind of person that I'm either going to be really good at one thing, but I can't be mediocre at a lot of things.
Yep.
So I that's why I actually got a new iPhone, because I liked the camera and I figured, well, at least I could take better Instagram pictures.
That's awesome. So you did it's Big Nerd Ranch, right? Is that the name?
Yep.
What do you remember? Like what year that was? You were doing that?
Oh, I think that had to be 2011 or 2010, somewhere around then.
Okay. Awesome. And so I guess from there, like it was just Ruby and Rails for you moving forward.
Yeah. So at the time I was working at an agency that did a lot of different stuff, and there was some Ruby projects, but I really wanted to do product work and not have a different project every week. I learned a lot working at an agency, and I think it's a really great way for someone who's a new programmer to figure out what they like to do, because it's the kind of thing, especially if you're working at a small place, where you can try everything. But once I figured out that I wanted to do Rails, I didn't want to do that kind of work anymore, especially because one week I'd be working on WordPress and the next week I'd be working on Rails, or I wouldn't even see Rails for a few weeks. And that's not what I wanted to do. So that's when I started applying for remote jobs, because there wasn't really any Ruby jobs around me. And that's when I got hired at FishMe. They have a Rails application that sends phishing emails so that your company can sort of train your employees not to click bad emails. And they actually rebranded recently to Cofense. But yeah, so I worked there for a couple of years. And then I moved on to Basecamp for 2.5 years, and now I've been at GitHub.
Awesome. FishMe, I didn't know what they did. I just had a little like thing I put over my laptop camera from them. That's really fascinating to know what they do.
Yeah, I remember seeing all the job postings from them for years.
So cool. So, you're actively like you are Rails core, correct?
Yep.
So I'm assuming that you didn't just wake up one day and you were on Rails core. How did I guess the process of like you starting to even just contribute to Rails begin?
Yeah. So I don't know what possessed me to start writing talks, but if you know me like longer, you'd say that's kind of weird. Like my mom is always like, I can't believe you give talks at conferences, because I used to be terrified of public speaking, partially because I had a few bad experiences in high school with it that just like didn't go well. And so I just used to think that if I tried to talk at a conference, I would die from just the act of trying to speak at a conference.
Yep. But I know exactly what you're saying. Eventually, I convinced myself that if I wanted my career to go in the direction that it has gone in, that I had to start speaking at conferences, because being visible is how you
can move through jobs that you want and like without having to, whiteboard. I guess that seems like a weird way to put it, but it's kind of like it gives you more credibility for what you're doing. So this seems like I went off a tangent, but this is part of the reason I ended up on Rails Core. So I wrote a talk about Active Record, and it had to do with how we assume that Active Record just like knows how to not take down our database, but that's not true. And so it's not Active Record's fault if you wrote a terrible query. And so what it did is it went through CRUD and looked at each of the different ways in which you can break your database with Active Record and what's a better way to do it. So with the create, if you're trying to create 1 million records and you're putting a lot of stuff into memory, you're going to take down your application. But you can write a batch insert query instead. I mean, Active Record doesn't actually have batch insert, but I was showing how you could do it without Active Record to do a batch insert instead of taking your database down. And in that, in the delete, I actually found a bug in Rails. Actually, I found 2 bugs. One was that if you didn't load the records first, it would in the console it would do a different query than if you did load the records. And in your application, you actually load all the records. So it's kind of like it would hide the bug in the console. And then the second bug was that the delete all was actually extremely slow because it was not doing the query correctly. And I can't remember exactly what we changed, but to fix that. But so I gave that talk, and Aaron Patterson was at that conference. It was at Mountain West Ruby. And he was like, oh, that's a bug. Let's fix it. And so we started pairing on fixing that bug. And then, I don't know, 4 years, 5 years later, we're still pairing on Rails stuff. So that's kind of how I got into contributing to Rails. And, it's just getting on like the Rails core team is not an easy process. You basically have to, figure out like how Rails works and how the processes work, and then contribute a lot, and then eventually like build a couple features that you're then responsible for life. It
Sure.
feels like, and that's sort of the process, because, we don't want anyone on Rails core to only have one like understanding of one framework, because, there's not a lot of us. So we have so many frameworks that we kind of have to share that responsibility of having a lot of experience in at least 2 of the frameworks in Rails.
Gotcha. I remember my first Railsconf was 2015 Atlanta, and you did a workshop on contributing to Rails. And I was like, oh, I'm going to do this. And then I went and I watched it. I was like, this is awesome. And then I chickened out. And 4 years later, I still never tried. But that's awesome. So that's also really cool that like your first talk, you find a bug, and then like Aaron's right there. It's like, let's work on it. Like, that's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. It was like one of those moments that you like can't create.
Right.
If it had been any other conference, like maybe he wouldn't have been there, and it would just be like, I'd be like, I don't know. I think I didn't even realize it was a bug at first. I was just like, this is weird.
That's awesome. So you said you were at Basecamp for 2 years?
Yeah, I think it was 2.5 about, yeah.
Did your time there like allow you to work on Rails more?
Yeah, somewhat. So I was on the security infrastructure and performance team, and generally our team worked on the other apps, keeping them up to date. And I did a lot of HackerOne triaging, which was interesting. I don't exactly like doing security. I mean, it's a really important thing, but it's like a super stressful role to have in an organization. So I'm glad that I don't really do security anymore.
Sure.
We have an entire team for that at GitHub, and it's great, and I'm not on it. So, but I would do a lot of the upgrades for Basecamp 3. And through that, like we'd sometimes find bugs and I'd fix those, or system testing was mostly written on Basecamp time. Although it was like I transferred from Basecamp to GitHub and I hadn't finished system testing. So I had like a lot of work to do that I ended up doing some weekend time on. But I'd say I do a lot more open source now because that's sort of the role. That's the role of our team. We don't do full-time open source, but we are always looking at what is in the GitHub application that doesn't belong there that we can upstream, and what do we need in the future for Rails to be useful, continue to be useful to us, so that, and then adding that stuff. We're not quite at like the future point yet, but that's my vision for our team. And once we get through some of the stuff that we're working on now, which is improving the current code base by extracting stuff, I want us to like start looking towards the future and saying like, what do we need to scale Rails, or what do we need so that these two protocols can talk to each other, or, just thinking ahead of how we can make Rails useful for the long term.
That's awesome. That, correct me if I'm wrong, that's recently like GitHub just went through a big upgrade. Like it is running 5 now, right?
Yeah, we're running 5.2.2 in production, and we have a second build that is running against Rails master.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
That runs every day. And my hope, I don't see a reason why this shouldn't happen, but we will start testing the betas and find any performance issues in production. And then on the day that we're on Rails 6, we will deploy Rails 6.
That's awesome. I bet that helps with also, like now that you're at that point, being able to kind of help push forward because you're not trying to get everything caught up.
Yeah, it's great. Also just being on 5.2 within the first couple of weeks, but like I think 4 or 5 engineers at GitHub got their first commit to Rails.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, because they found a bug, or they're like, I want this feature. And it's just really nice to see us not just able to contribute, but actively want to. It's just a really good feeling to see, because upgrading sucks. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It was awful. And hopefully my talk to Railsconf will be accepted and you can all hear like some of the awful stuff that we did. But upgrading is really hard. But once you're upgraded, if you can stay there, the impact that it has on your organization and on Rails and on everything is so massive that it pays in dividends for just doing the upgrade.
I could see that. My first like full-time Rails job, like we had a Rails maybe 4.1 at the time application, but like the legacy app that like a lot of the companies still use was Rails 2.0.2.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So like my first day there, like I went to do like I think it was just like a where query, and it was like, what are you talking about? You have to say like dot find and then give conditions. And I was like, I don't even understand this. It was an adventure.
Yeah, for sure.
So kind of touch on like system test. That's kind of one of the big features I believe you spearheaded, correct?
Yep.
Also one coming out that I saw you talk on, I think it was at Railsconf, was parallel testing. And I would just like to hear kind of more about where you like saw the need for that and like how you implement it, things like that.
So parallel testing is like one of those things that my name is on, but Aaron did most of the work.
Cool.
It's like kind of one of those classic things where one of us, like this is how a lot of the work gets done that we both do. One of us has an idea, we help each other implement it, and then one of us ends up like pushing it to the finish line and like getting most of the credit and also the blame. Because like for a couple of months, like every time like something didn't work right, David was like, Eileen, this isn't working right. And I was like, I didn't even write this part of the code. But yeah, I mean, we worked together on it. It was so DHH wanted it for a while, and originally someone else was interested in it. I think it was Arthur was interested in working on it, but then his role in GitHub changed, so he didn't have the bandwidth to work on that. And so it kind of got assigned to Aaron, and then because he was also at GitHub, and then it got, I worked on it too because I'm on Aaron's team. But it was sort of, so we did is used Ruby's DRB library to create the different processes to run the tests in. And then once that little script was done, the part that I helped work on the most was the support for the databases. So when you're using multiple processes, you need the application to create a database for each process to run the tests in so that it can split up the work. And so we added a hook into the parallel testing that creates the databases and then cleans them up at the end. And what's nice about it is it works. Now that I added the multiple database support, it actually just works out of the box. So in my Railsconf talk, I talked about, here's how you support multiple databases, blah, blah, blah. But we actually don't need to do that at all anymore. It now just works in Rails 6. So all of your databases should be created and torn down without you having to add anything to your application.
That's really cool. So I use the parallel test gem. And like you have to run a script, and I'm sure you're familiar with all this. It like creates all the extra databases you need, but then like anytime you run a migration, you have to like run another command for it to like go through all those databases and run those migrations. So that sounds nice that like Rails will just do that for you.
Yeah, it creates them, and then it uses the schema dump to fill in the database. So you don't even have to wait for migrations to run. And then at the end, it just cleans them up. So every time you run the suite, it creates new databases. So then you don't even have to worry about running migrations because because we use the schema to fill the database, it's theoretically very fast.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm very excited about that. I think even in like my email asking you to come on the show, I was telling you I'm excited about that.
Yeah, it'll be a good feature.
It's like an easy win for people with like powerful computers, kind of like air quoting here, and like slow test suites. Like it's an easy win for an organization just to be able to improve like output, I think. So
yeah, for sure.
Awesome. So I have just a couple more questions for you. So in my life, in my influence of friends, I don't really know anyone on Rails core. So I was just curious if you can, and you wouldn't mind explaining like kind of like what that process is like. I think you mentioned that like at minimum, like one person knows two frameworks kind of thing. Like, I'd be curious more about like how you like kind of decide on features as like a group, things like that.
I feel like I'm gonna burst everyone's bubble. Like everyone thinks that Rails core is really coordinated, but really the features that go into the next version of Rails are the ones that we personally are most excited about. If I didn't want to work on multiple databases, it would not be in Rails 6 because there isn't anyone else who had the bandwidth to do it. And it's been on the list for a long time of, it would be nice to have. And I think one of the reasons that it never got done was because everyone tried to solve the hardest problems first instead of the easiest problems first. So for me, I looked at it and I said, well, what's the easiest thing that I can solve? And the first was migrations in multiple directories. And then what's the second easiest thing I can solve? Let's make the rake tasks actually work with multiple databases. So then, at the bare minimum, you can delete a couple hundred lines of code if you're using multiple databases. But then I found like the big massive problem, which was the configurations don't work if you're using the 3-tier with the multiple databases. So I had to rewrite how configurations work in Rails, which was fun. And if you're listening and you are touching the configurations hash, you need to know in Rails 6, it's an object and it's not a hash. You can get a hash back, but it's an object. And so you're going to have to work with the object because we are going to remove the ability to 2H it eventually. But right now we have the 2H in place for single tier databases, or double, like your normal database YAML. But if you're using the new 3-tier database YAML for multiple databases, then, well, okay, you probably aren't because it was broken.
Okay.
So like I fixed it, but it's not a hash anymore. So I think that's like, I would be surprised if anyone was using it because it actually, your Rails app wouldn't be able to boot if you were, because of something in Rails. So I don't think that anyone is actually using a 3-tier config. I mean, we aren't at GitHub either. So I suspect that it's not going to actually break anyone's application because it wasn't working before. But anyway, that was the hardest thing because like we had to teach Rails about what the default database is when you have a 3-tier config because it didn't know. Because in a regular application, like in a single database application, it's just the environment that you're in. It's just development or it's just production. But if you have multiple databases in production, which one's the default? And so Rails didn't know, and we had to teach Rails.
For anybody that doesn't know, like, could you give an example of how you might lay out that in production if you're going to have multiple databases?
Yeah, well, under the production tag in the database YAML, you would have primary, and that would be your main database that you already have. That was your original production database. And then you would have a primary read-only, or you'd have, so like at GitHub, we have 10 primary databases that have different tables in each of them. So we would have production, and then the next key would be primary read-only. I'll make up a name, animals. We don't actually have an animals database, but animals read-only. And then in those, we would tell the structure, we would give it each of those their own structure file, and that would tell it what tables are in those databases. So in that 3-tier where you have a second key under the environment, before you actually define the database structure, before you define like the name, username, password, whatever, for multiple databases, we introduced a 3-tier configuration in Rails 5.2, I think, or 5.0, but it doesn't work. So it works in 6.
That's funny. So then does Active Record know automatically, basically, which models are in which database?
Yeah, so then what you would do after you set up the databases, you would create a parent model. So you would have something called like animals base, and you would say, we have a new API for connecting multiple databases. So there's a method. So instead of establish connection, you're going to use connects to, and then a role for that. So writing, and then the name of the database. So it would be connects to writing primary, reading primary read only. And so once you set that up, any model that inherits from that animals base will connect to the animals database, and you don't have to do anything else. Gotcha.
So it's kind of like, multiple application record things that you would inherit from just to organize that. That sounds pretty easy.
Yeah, it should be easy, hopefully. Got to write some documentation, but
yeah. How's the documentation process go for these new features like that?
I try to write docs when I'm working on it, but some of the stuff is in so much flux and evolution that we're gonna write. We usually look through documentation before a release, and fix it, write more, figure out where it's missing, add some guides. Yeah, that's usually how we do it.
And then are there like open tickets people can, or you guys organize it in milestones, right, on GitHub for like Rails 6, kind of like stuff that needs to get done that people can keep an eye on, or like find a place to go contribute docs if they wanted to try and help out?
We don't usually create issues like that, but that'd probably be a good idea, because I think the documentation is best written by someone who's never used the feature, because then they can be like, this is what's confusing and this is how it's hard. And
yeah, I've seen a couple people go and do that and just make like huge contributions to the guides, because it's like, well, if you've never used it before, then you know exactly the right questions to ask and like the right things to think about when you're like, well, how do I even do this? You ask that question, whereas if you're already familiar with the code, you're probably not going to be able to do that very easily because you kind of already know it all.
Yep.
So going back to what I guess you were saying earlier, it makes sense that like what gets worked on is kind of what people want in Rails, because at the same time, like you all do this out of like the goodness of your heart. So like it makes sense that you'd be most encouraged to like give your time by doing what interests you, which I think makes sense and is very cool.
Yeah, it's what interests us, or like what we need to do our jobs better.
Yeah.
Like some of the new frameworks in Rails 6 like came straight out of Basecamp work that DHH said, oh, well, I've written this for 4 applications in a row, so it's time to extract it. So that's where that kind of stuff comes from. But for the stuff coming out of GitHub, it's really currently driven by what do I want to get out of our application. Because we were on old versions for so long, there's a lot of tooling written into the app that should have never been there, because it has nothing to do with the application, and it just has to do with, it's really stuff that should be in the framework. So because it's, multiple databases. Well, what if we have a second application that's Rails that needs multiple databases? Are we going to rewrite all of that code? That's crazy. And the thing is, I've found applications where we did that, where we actually rewrote all of that code.
Oh, wow.
And it was like, okay, well, it's silly. We shouldn't do that. So trying to extract that stuff so that we can clean up those applications and then, really start to look at what's next. And I think that a lot of the contributions from GitHub for now are going to be extractions from our code base, rewritten to be a little better. A little bit less GitHub-like. So sometimes we have stuff that we really can't upstream because it's very GitHub specific. But, making sure that when we write that feature into Rails, adding the hooks that someone would need to be able to do that work. So then we can still delete a lot of code, but keep the way we do things, our proprietary stuff. So like one of the things that we do is we automatically switch whether we're reading or writing. Reading from the replica or reading from the primary, because if you've just written to your primary database, your replicas might not be caught up. So you don't want to necessarily send your users to the replica. But the way we calculate replication lag is very specific to our databases. That's not something we'd want to upstream, but we can upstream the automatic switching with like hooks that you would just write in your own application. When the applications should switch. So that's one of those things where like we kind of have to split the feature in half between what GitHub needs and what Rails needs.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm sure there's a lot of features like that you effectively are building in the sort of like, here's a new API you can plug into. This is what it's used for. How you're going to do it specifically is always going to be different, but make it easy to add your own custom thing in there. Are there any other cool new things that are sort of on the agenda to extract?
I don't want to make any promises, so I don't I'm not talk about those.
Dang.
It was a good question, Chris. I was rooting for you.
Yeah.
I think I'm really excited to see though, like what comes out of GitHub into Rails. It'll be nice to like have one more like major player like that, like pushing into Rails. It's encouraging as someone who writes Rails. So, My last question, Chris, unless you have any more questions you want to ask real quick.
No, go ahead.
I'm just curious, like, so you work at GitHub, you're Rails core. Imagine that's a lot of time just doing open source too. But like when you're not coding, what are things like you enjoy out of life?
Well, I recently got a Nintendo Switch. And I was never a gamer before, but I really enjoyed like fighting with Zelda. Like the game is very hard. So sometimes I spend time doing that. Let's see. I am a big fan of food and eating it, which sounds like kind of silly, but I like to go to different restaurants and like try what food they have, especially if there's like a new one in the area or if they've got like a fun tasting menu. Like one of my favorite things to do is just like go with another couple and like just hang out and chill. Kind of like if you've ever been to Europe and you've gone to dinner and then sat there for like 4 hours and realized like, why don't I do this more often? Because I went to Paris this summer and like every dinner we had we just like sat there forever eating and drinking wine and it was the kind of thing where you're like, why don't I do this more often? This is so fun. And the waitress isn't trying to make me leave.
Right.
Yeah.
So I like to sometimes do that in the US and like sort of pretend that I'm in Europe.
Yeah, I wish we did more of that here. It's like really enjoyable just to hang out for a while and do that, but it is not part of the culture here. Not much, at least.
Yeah.
Chris and I will just sit at McDonald's for hours.
Did you know that McDonald's is apparently designed to make you want to leave?
No. It makes sense.
I read
but I
that
didn't
somewhere. That like it's the way the music and the lighting and everything in there is designed so that you don't want to spend hours there because they want people to like leave.
Huh.
I mean, there's literally nothing that company does that like surprises me. So, wow.
It wouldn't surprise me. That's pretty funny.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Before you go, where can anyone listening find you on the internet?
You can find me anywhere, Eileen Codes. That's Twitter, GitHub, whatever, blog. Anywhere that I want you to find me, I'm Eileen Codes.
Awesome.
Easy.
Well, thanks again. And Chris, we will do this again soon.
All righty.